This is the week that was, dated the 23rd of April 2017. Happy St. George's Day, everyone. St. George, the patron saint of England, once slew a dragon, somewhere. Why? Nobody really knows. When? Is all the more of a hard question. But if the way in which much of England celebrates his feat is to be any guide, then he must have got right royally drunk once he had finished slaying the beast. Now, first off, I have a correction to make. At last week's The Week That Was, I stated that the MOAB massive bomb, which had been dropped on a cave and tunnel system in Afghanistan, was worth $16 million apiece. This figure was widely circulated in the media, but it appears the figure is wrong. The prize for pointing this out online seems to fall to Styx Hexenhammer 666. The figure of 16 million was apparently gleaned by the media from a military technology website, and nobody quite knows what their source is. What the actual cost of the complete program was, nobody really knows. The US Armed Forces priced the item at $170,000 apiece, but then they might have good cause to keep the figure low. That said, $170,000 seems a much more realistic price tag. Furthermore, apparently such a device has a limited shelf life, and this one's was coming to an end anyhow. Therefore, its price may have been purely theoretical. So, all that said, let's get on with the latest week that was. The 17th of April gave us this gem. It appears there have been moves to try to bring a private prosecution against one Tony Blair. Apparently, General Abdul Wahid Shanan ar-Rabat, who was once Chief of Staff of the Iraqi Armed Forces, tried to bring a prosecution against Tony Blair, his then Foreign Secretary Jack Straw, and the then Attorney General Lord Goldsmith. The private prosecution was to be brought for the crime of aggression. If it sounds a very vague allegation, then that is the reason the present Attorney General is intervening, trying to quell any further progress. The crime of aggression does not exist under English law. That said, it exists in international law, apparently. In November, a judge already ruled that Tony Blair enjoyed immunity from prosecution for such matters. Now there is a judge with whom I would like a word. So yes, it seems once again that English law is laying on a feast for lawyers, judges, and their extravagant fees. But one nonetheless watches on with interest. For who would not like to see Tony Blair get his comeuppance one day? And be it that it were a case brought by an Iraqi general. Talking of everyone's favourite Tony, Mr. Blair was on BBC Radio today, pontificating about what we ought to be doing regarding Brexit, for whom we ought to be voting and whom not. Because you see, Tony Blair knows about such things. He is a very knowing person. For example, to this day he remains the only person to know that there were weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. I do not have many kind words for George W. Bush, but at least he does us the courtesy, customary for ex-presidents, of staying out of sight. Maybe, just maybe, someone within the Bilderberg group or some other privileged cabal should tap Blair on the shoulder and ask him to follow Bush's example. On the 17th of April, we got news of another acid attack in London. 12 people were burnt by acid during an incident at a nightclub. Since, police have begun searching for some minor TV celebrity's boyfriend who they think might have been involved. The reason this is worth mentioning is that acid attack statistics in London have been escalating recently. Many who hear of these statistics draw the wrong conclusion and think this is related to so-called honour attacks by people from the Indian subcontinent. But this is not the case. This recent spate of acid attacks is to do with people, mainly young men, arming themselves with bottles of acid and carrying them as weapons. It is a very worrying development. One hopes the craze will either subside or that the police will somehow get a grip of it. For else I cannot see how people will be prepared to go unarmed if there are folks about with bottles of acid. On the 17th of April, we were told that what appears to be an unknown number of US F-35 fighter jets seems to have been transferred to Britain. This is part of the grandly named European Reassurance Initiative launched under President Barack Obama in 2014. In short, it is part of the NATO build-up against Russia, which is still underway. It is interesting that this build-up began while Barack Obama was in charge of the White House, continued while Donald Trump was supposedly keen on friendlier terms with Russia, and is now continuing once Trump has officially changed his position to declaring US-Russian relations at a historic low. Given the continuity of this build-up throughout, one cannot help but wonder whether the talk of better relations with Russia was just that, talk. Americans are not the most subtle of people. When it comes to the American armed forces, no operation is ever named Operation Squirrel Hunt or some such thing, which is brilliantly illustrated in the latest military exercises to be taken place in Korea. For the US and South Korean Air Forces will be engaging in exercise Max Thunder 17 on the 29th of April. This is set to involve 1,000 US personnel and 500 South Korean personnel. It will include F-16 and F-15 fighters, AV-8B Harriers, EA-18G Growlers, F-4 Phantom jets, F-5 Tiger jets, something called a K-1 Wungbai light attack aircraft, and several helicopters and transport aircraft. Many would agree that this is an enormous amount of hardware to be flying about in Korean skies at a time like this. Then again, much of what one hears about Korea often turns out to be nothing at all. Much confusion reigns regarding the story about the strike group around aircraft carrier Carl Vinson, which was, according to the White House, heading toward Korea. When everyone was expecting the strike group to be in the Sea of Japan, it turns out it was thousands of miles away, passing through the Sunda Strait off Indonesia for some exercises with the Australian Navy. This of course throws up all kinds of questions. Was it an elaborate bluff by the White House? If so, did one include the Chinese in this bluff, on whose cooperation much of the negotiations with North Korea depend? For if China was not informed, she will most certainly not be amused, and any goodwill gained at any presidential summit may well already have been lost. On the other hand, there is the simple possibility that the White House did not know where their carrier fleet was truly headed, which of course would be highly embarrassing, and even if it were to have been the case, one doubts the White House would ever admit to it. In any case, we are told that now, definitely, surely, certainly, the strike group is heading toward Korea. Scout's honor. On the 21st of April, we were treated to the insight that airlines prefer to hire pretty, young, slim stewardesses. This apparently is a shock revelation these days. Moreover, it is an outrage, so we are told. In any case, a Russian court rejected the sex discrimination case brought by Irina Yerusalimskaya. In an interesting twist, Aeroflot, the Russian national carrier, who is the defending party, argued that every extra kilo on a stewardess cost them 800 rubles in extra fuel per year. For context, 800 rubles equates to about £14, we are told, which would be roughly $17.50 in colonial currency. It all sounds very much like a pretext. But then, frankly, so does suing the airline in the first place. Maybe if you get a job because you are young and pretty, it follows that you will have that job for as long as you are young and pretty, be you Russian or otherwise. On the 20th of April, news hit that the US authorities were preparing to bring charges against one Julian Assange of Wikileaks fame. The intended charges go back to 2010, when Wikileaks posted information leaked by Bradley Manning. This of course raises the question whether Barack Obama's commuting of Manning's sentence may in fact have been conditional. In short, give us something on Assange and we will let you go. Do we know that this happened? No. But this looks highly suspect. Julian Assange could only be accused if he played an active part in gaining access to leaked information, if he encouraged the leak, promised financial reward, and so on. There really could only be one party who could supply such testimony, the one party they had in their clutches. But if Assange was simply in receipt of leaked information, then the man did nothing whatsoever wrong. Given how long this has taken, given how convoluted the Julian Assange story has become, With him being an effective refugee in the Ecuadorian embassy in London, it does look as though the US legal authorities needed to think long and hard before they could dream up something which they could present as a charge. Meanwhile, the UK has let it be known that the Swedish charges would come first. If the UK were to extradite Assange, it would thus be to Sweden. I hold that the UK authorities come out of this looking far from glorious. This entire story leaves a bad taste in the mouth. Julian Assange looks to be one of the few people left who is willing to risk life and limb for the truth. And look where it has got him. Meanwhile, President Trump, do you remember this?
You know, it's just awfully good that someone with the temperament of Donald Trump is not in charge of the law in our country.
Yeah, because you'd be in jail.
Secretary Clinton.
Well, Hillary Clinton is not in jail. Nor is any attempt being made. Instead, your law enforcement is now gearing up to go after the man who leaked the Podesta emails, which so hurt Hillary Clinton's election prospects and possibly made you president. We all heard it, Donald. The slogan was, "Lock her up," not "lock him up." If you and your people have decided to let off Clinton and instead go after the man who embarrassed her, what will that make you look like, Mr. President? It is becoming ever more clear that you are changing your mind on just about everything. You complain about fake news. Well, if there is one thing no one can level at Wikileaks, it is that they are fake news. They have so far managed to maintain a cast iron reputation. So you are going to be president when the one news outlet not accused of being fake news will see its founder charged by US authorities for publishing real news. All because your Secret Service bears a grudge for its own failings to keep its secrets secret. To all avail, Julian Assange seems to have done nothing wrong. To try to argue that he is some sort of spy is ludicrous. If he is a spy, it is worth keeping in mind that that would make him the spy who helped you win the presidency. If there is one man who looks like the hero in this, it surely is not you, Donald. You and your administration are looking like weasels right now. The weasels who let off Hillary. The weasels who did not lock her up. The weasels who instead went after the truth teller. There seems to be only one hero in this story. His name is Julian Assange. This week also saw yet another terrorist attack in Paris. This time it was a lone gunman. A 39-year-old called Karim Cheourfi, who pulled up in his car on the Champs-Élysées, got out with his Kalashnikov, and started shooting at police officers. He killed one police officer and wounded 2 others. In turn, he was shot dead. A note telling us of how wonderful the Islamic State is was found next to him. He must have been clutching it. One struggles to comprehend such insanity. Cheourfi seems, like so many of these self-proclaimed martyrs, to have lived a criminal life. There is a suspicion that he was radicalized in prison. The nonsense of keeping Islamists among the general prison population with other criminals surely must stop. As for the French general election, the impact of such continued attacks on the electoral result are almost impossible to estimate. But they would heavily favour both Marine Le Pen of the National Front and François Fillon of the Conservatives. In a remarkable statement, Antonio Tajani, the President of the European Parliament, made it clear that Brexit could easily be reversed should the UK general election bring in a new government. He was keen to stress that the decision was solely one for the UK electorate to make, but the inference was clear. Furthermore, he insisted that the European Court of Justice would be responsible for oversight of everything concerning the Brexit treaty. This in turn would mean that the UK would still need to remain subject to the European Court of Justice, which is an EU body. As it stands, the UK government differs very strongly on that view. Once again, the question of sovereignty arises here. One cannot help but get the impression that the EU is loath to let go of the various controls over sovereignty. One really cannot help but think that the various functionaries cannot understand, at a very basic level, what has actually happened with Brexit. On the 20th of April, something rather noteworthy took place in Germany. A company called Lilium tested an electrical vertical takeoff jet, which is seen as a prototype sky taxi of sorts. As innovations go, this is indeed quite eye-catching. Some of you may have heard of Philip Davis. He is a Tory MP who has dared to stand up to feminist paragons such as Labour's Jess Phillips in the UK Parliament, and has been somewhat of a men's rights champion. Now, silly as I think men's rights activism is, it is nonetheless very amusing to watch feminists become near apoplectic with rage at the idea of such an MP. But now, it appears, a possible solution to the evil Mr. Davis may have been found. One Sophie Walker, leader of the Women's Equality Party, yes, there is such a thing, has announced her candidature in the constituency of Philip Davis. Moreover, heavy lobbying seems to be going on to get the other so-called progressive parties to stand aside to allow Ms. Walker a free run at Mr. Davis, making it an out-and-out, head-to-head contest. If this were to come about, I suspect the residents of the constituency of Shipley would not know what had hit them. Things seem to be afoot north of the border. In the 2015 general election, the Scottish National Party won 56 seats out of 59. This proved especially devastating to Labour, which had traditionally heavily depended on Scottish votes. But now something else seems to be happening. The Conservatives have been widely reviled in Scotland ever since Margaret Thatcher. Much of this goes back to the infamous poll tax. But now, faced with the SNP and a Labour Party under Jeremy Corbyn, as well as new calls for a Scottish independence referendum, it seems some Scots are turning to the Tories. Now, polls always need to be viewed with a great deal of caution. Nonetheless, this latest poll seems to be significant just for the sheer size of the swing it indicates. Out of the people polled, 33% indicated they would vote Tory. If such a change were applied across the landscape, the Tories would be expected to win 11 additional constituencies, taking their total to 12. Now, I would caution anyone to conclude that this will therefore happen. Polls are fickle things. But you cannot have such a surge in a poll and grant it no credence at all. Clearly the Conservatives seem to be making significant headway. They have wholeheartedly embraced the mantle of the Unionist Party in Scotland. Also, Brexit is not as unpopular in Scotland as people like Nicola Sturgeon would have you believe. Sure, the majority of Scots voted to stay in the EU, but that is not to say that there is not a substantial body of people who in fact support Brexit. These factors most likely explain the sudden Tory surge. Either way, the vote in Scotland is going to prove a fascinating affair. This brings us to the end of this episode of The Week That Was. Before I go, I would like to take this opportunity to express my gratitude to one Sargon of Akkad, who hosted a video of mine recently on his channel. I am under no illusion that the recent surge of subscribers on my channel is entirely down to his generosity. My subscriber figure has effectively shot up from 3,000 to 10,000 within a matter of days. So thank you very much, Mr. of Akkad. Should you ever need another clip to fill a gap when you are off to sunnier climes, just let me know. That is all from the Cyberpass for now. Thank you very much, and goodbye.